Hey everyone, welcome back to our English Learning Podcast. We're so happy you're here with us today. Whether this is your first time listening or you've been with us for a while, we're thrilled to have you. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest struggles English learners face: thinking fast and speaking smart in real conversations. Let me ask you, have you ever had this experience? You're in a conversation. Someone asks you a question in English and nothing. Your brain goes blank. You know the words, but you just can't get them out fast enough. Or maybe you start speaking, but you keep stopping because you're worried about saying the wrong thing. Sound familiar?
If that sounds like you, don't worry. You're not alone. This is one of the most common problems for English learners. And it's not because you're bad at English. It's because your brain hasn't learned how to think in English yet. But the good news is, you can fix that. And in today's episode, we're going to show you how.
That's right. By the end of this episode, you'll know exactly how to think faster in English, speak more naturally, and feel confident even when conversations move quickly. And stick around until the end, because we're giving you a powerful technique that will help you speak faster and more smoothly starting today.
Chapter 1. Why you struggle to think fast in English. All right, let's get straight to it. Why is it so hard to think quickly in English? You know that feeling. Someone asks you a simple question like, "How was your day?" And instead of answering smoothly, your mind goes blank. You know the words, you understand the question, but you just can't respond fast enough. Sound familiar? Here's the truth. The problem isn't that you don't know enough English. It's not that you need to memorize more vocabulary or master more grammar rules. The real problem is that your brain is trying to work in two languages at the same time, and that's slowing you down. Let me explain. If your native language is Spanish, for example, and someone asks you, "What do you do for work?" your brain automatically processes the question in Spanish first, "¿A qué te dedicas?" And then it tries to translate that into English before you respond. And that takes time. Your brain is doing extra work, translating from one language to another instead of thinking directly in English. And you know what's worse? While your brain is working hard trying to translate, you start overthinking. Is this the right word? What if I use the wrong tense? What if they don't understand me? Suddenly, you're not just translating, you're panicking. And that's when you freeze. So it's not that you don't know the words, it's that your brain hasn't learned how to think directly in English yet. But here's the good news. You can train your brain to stop translating and start responding automatically. And that's exactly what we're going to help you with today.
Yes! That's such an important point, because so many learners think, if I just learn more vocabulary, I'll be able to speak faster. But that's not how fluency works. Think about it. You probably know a lot of English words already. You might even be able to understand a whole Netflix show in English. But understanding and speaking are two different skills. Let me give you an example. I had a student named Marco from Italy. He was amazing at listening. He could understand conversations, podcasts, even movies without subtitles. But when it came to speaking, he'd freeze. He'd say, "I know what I want to say. I just can't get it out fast enough." That's because his brain was still processing in Italian first, then translating it into English. And that delay is what was holding him back. That's why native speakers sound fast. Not because they're speaking faster than you can understand, but because they're not translating. They're thinking directly in the language. When someone asks, "What do you do for work?" they don't have to process it in their head. Their brain has already made the connection, question to response. That's why the conversation flows naturally. But here's the best part. You can train your brain to work the same way. It's not about learning more words. It's about retraining how your brain processes language. You can teach your brain to stop translating and start thinking directly in English. And once you do that, you'll be able to respond faster and more naturally.
And let's talk about the fear factor, because that's another huge reason why you freeze up in conversations. How many times have you had this thought? What if I say the wrong word? What if I sound stupid? What if they laugh at me? That fear of making mistakes is slowing you down more than any vocabulary gap ever will. Here's why. When you're nervous, your brain goes into fight or flight mode. That's a survival instinct. Your brain is trying to protect you from embarrassment. But the problem is, when your brain is in survival mode, it shuts down your ability to think creatively and respond quickly. That's why you freeze up. I had a student named Mia from Japan. She told me, I know I need to practice speaking, but every time I open my mouth, I panic. I feel like everyone's watching me. So we worked on shifting her focus. Instead of trying to speak perfectly, I told her to focus on just getting her message across. After 2 weeks of practice, she told me, I'm still making mistakes, but I'm not freezing anymore. Why? Because she let go of the pressure to be perfect. And that freed up her brain to actually respond.
Exactly. Mistakes don't matter. Communication does. When a native speaker makes a mistake, and they do all the time, they don't stop and apologize. They just keep going. That's why they sound fluent, because they're not trying to be perfect. They're trying to be understood. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're at a cafe and you say, I want coffee with no sugar, please. Technically, you should say, without sugar. But guess what? The barista is still going to understand you. They're not going to stop and say, excuse me, your grammar was incorrect. No, they'll just make your coffee. That's why you need to stop putting pressure on yourself to speak perfectly, because perfect English doesn't exist. Focus on connection, not perfection.
Yes. So now you know the 3 main reasons why you're struggling to think fast in English. 1. Translating in your head instead of thinking directly in English. 2. Overthinking and analyzing every word before you speak. 3. Fear of making mistakes, which creates mental blocks and slows you down. But here's the exciting part. Every single one of those problems is fixable. You don't need more vocabulary. You don't need to memorize grammar rules. You need to change how you think about English. And that's a skill you can build with the right techniques.
And that's exactly what we're going to work on today. In the next part, we're going to show you how to stop translating and start thinking directly in English. We'll give you simple exercises you can practice every day, and once you master them, you'll notice yourself responding faster and more confidently in conversations.
And trust me, once you make this shift, everything changes. Conversations will feel easier. You'll stop hesitating. You'll stop overthinking. And that's when you'll feel like you've finally unlocked real fluency.
So stay with us, because the next step is where the real magic happens. Let's teach your brain to think directly in English, and once you do that, speaking fast and naturally will become so much easier.
Chapter 2. Stop translating. Start thinking in English. All right, it's time to fix one of the biggest barriers to fluency, translating in your head. This is the number 1 reason why you freeze or hesitate in conversations. And the solution isn't more vocabulary or grammar. It's retraining your brain to think directly in English. Let me explain why this happens. When you've spent your whole life speaking your native language, your brain naturally defaults to that language first. So when someone asks you, what do you do for work? Your brain automatically processes it in your native language first. If you speak Spanish, for example, you might think, ¿A qué te dedicas? Then your brain scrambles to translate it into English. And that's where the delay happens. But here's the thing. Fluent speakers aren't faster because they know more words. They're faster because they don't have to translate. When someone asks, what do you do for work? They immediately think in English. No middle step. Their brain has been trained to connect the idea directly to the language. And that's exactly what you need to start doing. So how do you stop translating? You train your brain to think in English, and you do that by building direct mental associations between objects, words, and ideas. Your brain needs to connect the sound and meaning of a word directly to the concept without going through your native language. Let me give you an example. If you see an apple, your brain should immediately think apple, not manzana or pomo or whatever the word is in your native language. The word apple should be directly tied to the image of an apple. That's how native speakers think. They don't translate, they associate. And you can train your brain to do the same thing. Let's try a quick exercise right now. I'm going to say a word and I want you to immediately think of the first word in English that comes to mind. Not in your native language, in English. And say it out loud if you can. Ready? 1. Cat. 2. Blue. 3. Coffee. 4. Happy, say. 5. Book. See what's happening? You're training your brain to create a direct connection between the word and the meaning. You're skipping the translation step, and that's the key to faster thinking.
That's so powerful, because once your brain starts making those direct connections, your speaking speed increases naturally. And here's the best part. You can practice this anytime, anywhere. You don't need a teacher or a classroom. You can build this habit in your everyday life. Let me give you a practical way to do this. Start labeling things around your house in English. Take some sticky notes and label your table, your window, your mirror, your refrigerator. Everything. Then, every time you see that object, say the word in English out loud. For example, when you walk past the mirror, say mirror. When you sit at the table, say table. That way, you're building an automatic connection between the object and the word. And that creates faster recall. And you don't need to stop there. Extend this to actions too. When you're making coffee, say, I'm making coffee. When you're brushing your teeth, say, I'm brushing my teeth. When you're leaving the house, say, I'm leaving now. This builds fluency because you're training your brain to think directly in English instead of relying on translations. And here's another strategy that works incredibly well. Shadowing. Shadowing is when you listen to a native speaker. It could be a podcast, a YouTube video, or even a TV show. And you repeat exactly what they say, at the same speed, with the same tone and rhythm. It's like following their speech patterns in real time. This forces your brain to process English quickly. And the more you do it, the easier it gets.
Yes. Shadowing is so powerful because it teaches your brain to think in English at the speed of conversation. And here's something else that helps. Use mental images instead of translations. If you hear the word dog, don't let your brain think of the word in your language. Picture a dog in your mind. If you hear the word beach, imagine the ocean, the sand, the sun. That creates a stronger connection because your brain responds faster to images than to words. Here's an example. If I say the word coffee, your first thought should be the smell, the taste, the cup in your hand, not the word in your language. That makes the connection faster because you're bypassing the translation step completely. Let's try it right now. I'm going to say a word, and I want you to immediately imagine it in your mind. 1. Tree. 2. Sun. 3. Ice cream. 4. Mountain. 5. Rain. See what's happening? You're not thinking of the word in your language. You're connecting it directly to the image. That's how native speakers process language, and that's how you need to train your brain to work.
And let me tell you why this works. Your brain processes images faster than words. When you create a direct link between a word and an image, without going through translation, your brain starts working faster. That's why native speakers can respond quickly, because their brain isn't doing extra work. Let me give you a real-life example. I had a student named Lucas from Germany. He told me that he could understand English pretty well, but he always froze in conversations. He said, "My brain feels too slow." So I told him to stop translating and start using mental images. After 2 weeks of practice, he told me, It's like my brain unlocked. The words are coming out faster now. That's because he stopped going through his native language, and his brain started processing English more efficiently. And here's another exercise you can try. Take 5 objects in your house, look at them, and describe them out loud in English. For example, if you see a chair, say, "This is a chair. It's made of wood. It's brown. It's comfortable." Do that every day, and you'll be amazed at how quickly your brain starts making those direct connections.
Yes. And here's another quick fix. Stop trying to find the perfect word. If you can't remember the word for umbrella, just say, the thing you use when it rains. If you forget the word fridge, just say, the thing that keeps food cold. Native speakers do this all the time. They describe things when they forget the right word. And that keeps the conversation flowing.
Exactly. Fluent speakers don't know every word, they just know how to work around gaps. If you can't find the right word, don't freeze. Just describe it or use a simple phrase like, "What's the word for?" That keeps you in the conversation, and that's what fluency is all about.
So here's the key takeaway. Stop translating. Start thinking in English. Build direct connections between English words and mental images. Practice shadowing, label things in your house, and focus on communication, not perfection. The more you train your brain to skip the translation step, the faster you'll think and speak in English.
Chapter 3. Practice fast responses. All right, now that you're starting to think directly in English, it's time to train your brain to respond faster. Understanding English is one thing, but responding quickly and naturally in real conversations is a whole different skill, and that's what we're going to work on right now. Let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where someone asked you a simple question and you knew the answer, but you just couldn't get the words out fast enough? Your mind starts racing, you panic, and then silence. That's because your brain isn't trained to retrieve English quickly. It's like a muscle that hasn't been exercised. But here's the good news. You can train your brain to respond faster. And the best way to do that is through quick question and answer drills. Think of it like a reflex. The more you practice, the faster your brain will start responding automatically. Let's get started. I'm going to ask you some simple questions. Your job is to answer out loud as quickly as possible. Don't overthink it. Don't worry about grammar. Just say the first thing that comes to your mind. The goal isn't to be perfect. The goal is to respond. Ready? Let's go. 1. What's your name? 2. Where are you from? 3. What did you have for breakfast? 4. What's your favorite color? 5. Do you like pizza? How did that feel? If you hesitated, that's totally normal. The goal isn't to give a perfect answer. It's to get comfortable responding quickly. And the more you do this, the faster you'll get.
That's right. Let me tell you why this works. When you train your brain to respond without overthinking, you create automatic responses. Think about how you answer questions in your native language. You don't stop and think about grammar, right? You just respond. That's what we're training your brain to do in English. And here's the secret. Fast thinking comes from muscle memory, not from knowledge. You already know the words, but your brain needs practice pulling them out quickly. That's why quick response drills work so well. They help you develop that automatic reflex. Let's take it up a level. I'm going to ask you some slightly harder questions now, and I want you to answer just as quickly. Don't worry about getting it perfect, just speak. Are you ready? 1. What's one thing you're really good at? 2. If you could visit any country tomorrow, where would you go? 3. What's the last movie you watched? 4. How would you describe your best friend? 5. If you had to eat one meal for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Good! How did that feel? If you stumbled or hesitated, that's completely fine. That's part of the process. The more you practice, the faster your brain will adapt. It's like going to the gym. You're building that muscle memory every time you answer quickly. And here's a pro tip. When you don't know the exact word, don't freeze. Just describe it. Let's say you can't remember the word for scissors. Instead of saying nothing, you could say, the thing you use to cut paper. That's exactly what fluent speakers do. Let's try it. I'm going to describe something, and I want you to guess what I'm talking about. Ready? 1. It's cold. You keep food in it, and it makes ice. What is it? 2. It's something you wear on your feet when you go outside. What is it? 3. It's sweet, cold, and you usually eat it in the summer. What is it? 4. It's soft, you sleep on it, and it's usually next to a blanket. What is it? 5. You use it to write on paper. What is it? See how that works? Even if you didn't know the exact word, you could still figure out what I was describing. And that's exactly how real conversations work.
Yes, that's the key. When you don't know the exact word, don't panic. Work around it. Native speakers do this all the time. Think about it. If a native speaker forgets the word umbrella, they might say, "the thing you use when it rains." No one is going to stop the conversation or correct them because communication is what matters. And here's another strategy that works like magic. Keep the conversation going with filler phrases. When you're thinking of what to say next, instead of freezing up, use a phrase to give yourself time. For example, "That's a good question. Let me think for a second." "Well, actually, I'm not sure, but..." These phrases buy you time and keep the conversation flowing, even when you're thinking. Let's practice. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer. But before you answer, use a filler phrase. Ready? 1. What's your favorite movie? 2. Where would you like to travel next? 3. What's one thing you'd like to learn this year? 4. Who's someone you admire? 5. What's the best gift you've ever received? Good. Did you notice how the filler phrases gave you extra time to think? That's what fluent speakers do naturally. They use these phrases to stay in control of the conversation while their brain catches up.
And here's one more technique. If you don't know the answer, don't freeze. Redirect the question. Let's say someone asks, "What's your favorite book?" and you can't think of one. Instead of panicking, you could say, "I'm not sure, but I really enjoy reading science fiction." Or you could say, "That's a tough question. How about you?" This keeps the conversation going and gives you more time to think. Let's try it. I'm going to ask you a question, and if you don't know the answer, just redirect it back to me. Ready? 1. What's your favorite sport? 2. What's one place you'd love to visit? 3. If you could have dinner with any person, living or dead, who would it be? See how that works? Redirecting the question gives you more time, and it makes you sound confident and natural.
So, here's the key takeaway. You don't need to have the perfect answer. The goal is to keep the conversation moving. Use filler phrases, work around unknown words, and redirect questions if you need to. The more you practice this, the faster and more natural your responses will become. Chapter 4. Use filler phrases to buy time. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in the middle of a conversation and suddenly your mind goes blank? You know the feeling. Someone asks you a question and you know you have the answer, but your brain just isn't giving it to you fast enough. You freeze, your heart races, and you start thinking, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I sound stupid? And then, silence. This is one of the biggest confidence killers for English learners. And it's not because you don't know the answer. It's because your brain needs a second to organize your thoughts. But instead of giving yourself that second, you panic. You feel like you need to answer immediately, so you either blurt out something wrong or you freeze completely. But here's the secret. Native speakers have this problem too. The difference is, they know how to buy time without making the conversation awkward. They use what we call filler phrases, small natural expressions that give them a moment to think while still keeping the conversation flowing. You've probably heard them before. Well, let me think about that. That's a good question. Actually, that's interesting. These phrases sound simple, but they're incredibly powerful. Why? Because they keep you in control of the conversation even when your brain needs a second to catch up. Let's say someone asks you, what's the best place you've ever traveled to? If your mind goes blank, instead of standing there in silence, you could say, well, let me think about that for a second. Now you've given yourself an extra 2 or 3 seconds to think, and you sound relaxed and confident while doing it. And that's the key. Filler phrases make you sound confident even when you're not sure what to say. Native speakers use them all the time. It's why conversations sound smooth, even when the speaker is figuring out their answer in real time.
Exactly. Let me give you a real-life example. I had a student named David from Spain. He told me that his biggest problem wasn't understanding English. It was responding quickly. He said, "I get so nervous when someone asks me a question, and if I don't know the answer immediately, I freeze." So I taught him this simple trick. When someone asks you a question and you need a second to think, say, "That's a good question," or, let me think about that." And guess what? It completely changed how he spoke. He told me, "Now I don't feel rushed. I give myself time to think, and I sound more natural." And that's exactly how native speakers handle it. Think about the last time you saw an interview or a conversation on TV. Even professional speakers use filler phrases when they need time to think. You'll hear them say things like, "That's interesting. I've never thought about that before. Let me see how I can explain this." They're not perfect. They're just good at managing the flow of the conversation. And that's what filler phrases allow you to do. And here's why it works so well. When you use a filler phrase, it signals to the other person that you are going to answer. You just need a second to think. That keeps the conversation flowing, and it makes you sound thoughtful and confident instead of nervous and unsure.
Yes, and let's talk about tone. Because how you say these phrases matters. If you say, well, I don't know, it sounds insecure. But if you say, that's a good question, with a calm and relaxed tone, it sounds thoughtful. Confidence isn't just about the words, it's about the delivery. Let's try it out right now. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer each one using a filler phrase first. You don't need to give a perfect answer. Just focus on using a filler phrase to buy yourself time. Ready? What's your favorite type of music? Where would you like to travel next? If you could have dinner with anyone, living or dead, who would it be? What's one skill you wish you could master? What's the best gift you've ever received? Did you notice how using a filler phrase gave you extra time to think? That's the magic of filler phrases. They give you space to organize your thoughts without breaking the flow of the conversation.
Exactly. And here's another trick. Combine filler phrases with simple redirection. Let's say you're asked a question and you really have no idea how to answer. Instead of panicking, you could say, "That's a tough question. What about you?" Now you've redirected the conversation back to the other person, and you've bought yourself extra time to think. For example, if someone says, "What's the most important lesson you've learned in life?" and you don't know how to answer, you could say, "That's a deep one. What about you?" Now you're showing interest in the other person, and you've kept the conversation going without freezing. Let's practice that right now. I'm going to ask you a question. And if you don't know the answer, just redirect it back to me using a filler phrase. Ready? What's the best piece of advice you've ever received? If you could change one thing about your life, what would it be? If you won the lottery tomorrow, what's the first thing you'd do? What's one thing you wish you had learned earlier in life? If you could have any job in the world, what would it be? See how that works? Instead of feeling pressure to give the perfect answer, you're buying time and keeping the conversation flowing.
And here's another powerful move. If you're really stuck and need even more time, use a two-part filler phrase. Something like, well, that's a tough one. Let me think for a second. I've never really thought about that before. Let me see. That's a good question. Actually, now that I think about it, this gives you even more time, and the other person will see it as thoughtful, not as hesitation.
And here's the best part. Once you get comfortable using filler phrases, you'll notice that you stop feeling that freeze when you speak. Your brain will get used to having that extra time, and you'll sound more natural and confident in every conversation.
That's right. Confidence isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about handling the moments when you don't know the answer. And filler phrases give you the tools to do that. You don't need to speak perfectly. You just need to keep the conversation going.
Chapter 5. Build Automatic Speaking Patterns. Let me tell you a secret about fluent speakers. They don't invent sentences from scratch every time they speak. They rely on automatic patterns, phrases and responses that are so deeply wired into their brains that they come out automatically, without thinking. Think about how you respond in your native language when someone asks, "How are you?" You don't stop and carefully think about your response, right? You just say, "I'm good" or "not bad." It's automatic. You don't analyze the grammar or think about which tense to use. The words just come out. That's because your brain has built a shortcut for those patterns. And that's exactly how fluent English speakers operate. They're not forming every sentence from scratch. They're using pre-built patterns that have become second nature. That's why their speech sounds smooth and natural, because they've trained their brain to pull up the right patterns without thinking. Here's an example. When someone says, "Nice to meet you," the automatic response is, "Nice to meet you too." You don't stop and think, "What's the right way to say this?" It's just an automatic exchange. Or when someone asks, "How's it going?" you instinctively say, "Good, thanks. You?" That's not creativity. That's muscle memory. And the best part? You can train your brain to use these patterns the same way, so that your responses become quick and natural without needing to process them consciously.
Exactly. Think about the last time you were in a conversation and someone asked you something simple like, "What's your name?" or "Where are you from?" You probably didn't freeze up because you've already practiced those answers so many times that they've become automatic. But when the conversation gets more complex, that's when hesitation starts. That's because you haven't built enough patterns yet. But once you do, your brain will stop hesitating because it won't have to create responses from scratch anymore. It'll just grab the pattern you've already trained, and the words will flow naturally. Let me give you a real example. I had a student named Anna from Russia. She was really strong at vocabulary and grammar, but conversations still felt hard for her. She told me, "I understand everything, but when I speak, I keep stopping and second-guessing myself." So we worked on building automatic patterns. We practiced simple things like, "Can I have a... I'll take the... That's interesting. Could you repeat that?" After a few weeks, she told me, "It's like I don't even have to think anymore. The words just come out." That's because she had trained her brain to rely on patterns instead of creating new sentences every time.
That's exactly it. And this works for every part of the conversation. Introductions, small talk, asking for help, giving opinions. There are patterns for everything. And once you memorize those patterns, they become shortcuts. Let me give you some examples of everyday patterns that native speakers use all the time. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too. What do you do? I work in... How was your weekend? It was good. Can I get a... Sure, anything else? These are predictable exchanges, and once you've trained your brain to respond automatically, you don't have to stop and think. The responses just flow. Let's put this into practice. I'm going to start a sentence, and I want you to finish it automatically. Don't overthink it. Just let the words come out naturally. Nice to meet you. I'll have a... Sorry, could you... That's really... I think I'll... How did that feel? If you hesitated, that's totally normal. But the more you practice, the faster these patterns will become second nature.
Yes. And the more natural these patterns feel, the more confident you'll sound. Because confidence comes from certainty. And when your brain already knows the pattern, you'll feel more relaxed in conversations. Let's try another round, but this time, I'll make it more conversational. Answer naturally and quickly. No thinking, just speaking. How's it going? Do you have any plans this weekend? What kind of music do you like? Did you watch the game last night? How long have you been learning English? Did you notice how certain answers just rolled off your tongue? That's the power of automatic patterns. You're not creating answers from scratch anymore. You're just filling in the blanks with responses that you've already trained.
And here's the key. Once you've built enough patterns, conversations stop feeling like a test. You're not trying to figure out what to say. You're just reacting naturally. That's what makes native speakers sound fluent. They're not searching for words. They're just using familiar patterns. Let me give you some of the most common speaking patterns that you should memorize and practice until they become automatic. Introducing yourself. Hi, I'm asking for help. Could you help me with giving an opinion? I think that. Agreeing. I totally agree. Disagreeing politely. I see your point, but asking for clarification. What do you mean by that? Changing the subject. By the way, closing the conversation. It was great talking to you. If you master these patterns, you'll be able to handle 90% of conversations without needing to think too much. Let's try a quick role play. I'll be the other person. You respond using the patterns we just talked about. Ready? Hey, what's your name? Where are you from? What's your favorite kind of food? That's interesting. Tell me more about that. It was great talking to you. See how easy that becomes once you've practiced the patterns? The conversation flows naturally because you're not searching for the right words anymore.
And here's another secret. Native speakers don't even realize they're using patterns. But you can be intentional about learning them. Memorize them, practice them, use them in real conversations. And soon, they'll become automatic for you too. And don't forget, you don't need to say the perfect thing. If someone says, "How's it going?" you don't need to give a detailed answer. "Good, thanks. You?" is enough. Fluency isn't about complexity, it's about flow. Chapter 6. Mindset Shift. Focus on progress, not perfection. Let me ask you something. Why are you learning English? Is it to impress people with your flawless grammar? Or is it to connect with people, share your thoughts, and have meaningful conversations? Here's the truth. You're not trying to sound perfect. You're trying to communicate. But so many learners get stuck because they're focused on perfection instead of progress. They think, if I make a mistake, people will laugh at me. Or, if I don't say it perfectly, they'll think I'm not smart. That mindset is exactly what's holding you back. Let me give you an example. I had a student named Emma from Japan. She knew a lot of English. Her vocabulary was strong and her grammar was excellent, but she told me, "I don't feel comfortable speaking." I asked her why, and she said, "Because I'm afraid of making a mistake." So she would sit quietly in conversations even though she knew exactly what she wanted to say. So we worked on changing her mindset. Instead of focusing on being perfect, I told her to focus on getting her message across. I said, if you say, "I go to store yesterday," guess what? The other person will still understand you. No one cares if you make a small grammar mistake. They care about understanding you. And you know what happened? When Emma stopped focusing on perfection, she started speaking more. She started joining conversations without hesitation. And her confidence improved almost overnight. Why? Because she stopped trying to sound perfect and started focusing on connection. And that's the shift you need to make. If you're waiting until you can speak perfectly before you start speaking, you'll be waiting forever. Perfection is not the goal. Fluency comes from action, from using the language, even when it's messy.
Exactly. And here's something that might surprise you. Native speakers make mistakes all the time. I've made grammar mistakes in this conversation already, but you probably didn't even notice. That's because fluent speakers don't focus on mistakes. They focus on communication. Think about it. How often do native speakers say things like, "Me and my friend went to the store," instead of "my friend and I"? Or how often do you hear someone say, "There's less people here today," instead of "There are fewer people here today"? Technically, those are mistakes, but no one cares because the meaning is clear, and that's what matters. I had a student named Carlos from Brazil. He was so focused on using perfect grammar that he would freeze up every time he made a mistake. If he used the wrong verb tense, he would stop and say, "Oh no, sorry, I meant to say," and it would break the flow of the conversation. So I told him, "Stop apologizing. If you say, 'I go to the store yesterday,' and someone understands you, you've already succeeded." And guess what? Once Carlos stopped correcting himself in real time, his conversations started to flow naturally. He told me, "I feel so much more relaxed now. And I'm actually making fewer mistakes because I'm not overthinking every word." That's the magic of shifting your mindset. When you stop obsessing over perfection, your brain relaxes, and your speech improves naturally. And here's another thing. Mistakes actually make you more relatable. When you make a small mistake and laugh it off, the other person feels more comfortable with you. Why? Because it shows you're human. People don't connect with perfection. They connect with authenticity.
That's so true. Think about the last time you heard someone speaking your native language with an accent or making a small mistake. Did you think, wow, they sound stupid? Of course not. You probably thought, wow, they're trying to speak my language. That's impressive. That's exactly how native English speakers feel when you're speaking English. No one expects you to speak like a dictionary. If you say, "I'm really enjoy this," instead of, "I'm really enjoying this," no one will stop the conversation and correct you. They'll keep listening because they care about what you're saying, not whether you got the verb tense exactly right. And here's the truth. Perfection is the enemy of progress. If you're waiting to speak until you can do it perfectly, you're never going to improve. Fluency comes from action, from speaking even when you're not 100% sure, from pushing through the mistakes, knowing that every time you try, you're getting better. Let me ask you this. Would you rather have perfect grammar but never speak? Or would you rather have natural conversations, even if you make mistakes along the way? The answer is obvious, right? And here's the best part. The more you speak, the fewer mistakes you'll make over time. Your brain will naturally adjust. Your ear will get used to the sound of the language. You'll start noticing patterns, and those mistakes will disappear without you even realizing it, because you're using the language consistently.
And that's the final mindset shift you need to make. Stop treating mistakes as failures. Mistakes are not failures. They are proof that you're learning. Every mistake you make is one step closer to fluency. If you're not making mistakes, you're not improving. Mistakes mean you're putting yourself out there. They mean you're trying. And that's what matters. Let me give you a personal example. When I was learning Spanish, I once said, "Estoy embarazada," to mean, "I'm embarrassed." But guess what? That actually means when I'm pregnant. Was it embarrassing? Sure. But did the conversation stop? Number. The person I was talking to laughed, and then helped me with the correct word. That's how you learn, through trial and error. And that's exactly how you'll improve in English. If you say something wrong, laugh it off. Correct yourself if you want to, or just keep going. The conversation will continue, and so will your progress.
So here's the takeaway, Car. Progress over perfection. Forget the idea that you need to speak perfectly to be fluent. You don't. Fluency means being able to express yourself naturally and confidently, even when you make small mistakes. And remember, no one cares about your mistakes as much as you do. Native speakers aren't listening for errors. They're listening to understand you. And if they understand you, you're already winning.
So here's your challenge. After this episode, go out and start a conversation in English. Don't wait until you feel ready. Just start talking. If you make a mistake, keep going. Don't apologize. Don't correct yourself. Just keep the conversation flowing. That's how you'll build real fluency.
See you in the next episode. Thank you.